and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Arish Shah. Today in the studio with me, I have Jeremy Wastall. Jeremy operates at the intersection of global business expansion and technology. As CEO at Go Global, he leads a team focused on simplifying global operations in over 130 countries. Previously, he was instrumental in scaling revenue for Papaya Global, where he expanded the EMEA division from 1 to 30 people, generating 70% of its revenue. His extensive experience also includes roles at Precision Global Consulting, helping UK staffing agencies enter the US market. Jeremy's insights into the complexities of cross-border operations and the dynamics of capital without external funding provide a unique perspective on growth in today's business climate. In today's episode, we talk about PEO, EOR, GEO, and what's the difference?
Originally, in the US, there was a model called PEO, Professional Employment Organization, which is kind of like co-employment.
How sometimes the regulatory situation will drive your expansion strategy.
Those companies will need to have, if they want to get a license in the country, they need to have an entity in order to apply for the license.
Whether EOR helps democratize employment.
You're now giving opportunity to people all around the world that maybe traditionally wouldn't have had access to that employer.
How Go Global operates in 85 countries, delivering in over 100, and what are the 5 key stages of international expansion?
We've created this international expansion guide. We kind of see there's 5 key stages to international expansion.
How companies in the US, UK, and China are all in expansion mode, and why you can always consider expansion via acquisition.
If you don't want to go through the process of setting everything up and hiring a local team and going slow, companies will sometimes expand via acquiring a business on the ground. They have everything set up, they have clients, they have operations, and you can enter the market that way.
Let's get straight into it. Hi there, whilst I've got you for a second, I thought I'd reintroduce myself. My name's Arish, I'm the host of Nothing Ventured, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture ecosystem go round. I'm also the founder of Emerge One, a consultancy that provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups from seed to Series B and beyond. If you enjoy the podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and share wherever it is that you listen. And if you ever want to have a chat with me, do reach out on LinkedIn or X. I'm always up for a bit of a natter. Right, let's get straight into it. Jeremy, really great to have you here in the studio with me. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks. Really good to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem at all. Let's talk about the employer of record model, because we've seen massive growth in that sort of sector since the pandemic, but many view it as a bit of a temporary fix. What are the factors that could lead to a tipping point where companies should transition from employer of record to establishing in-house operations instead? And what are the trade-offs or risks that are most commonly overlooked in that decision and scenario?
Yeah, so maybe just very quickly a little brief history on EOR, not to go too deep on it, but originally in the US there was a model called PEO, Professional Employment Organization, which is kind of like co-employment and allows organizations to share the employment of these workers. And as US companies started to expand internationally and go into new markets, they didn't necessarily want to have their own entity because they don't know what they're doing. Similar to sometimes in the US, it's quite a complex market. So these different EOR organizations started popping up. And at the time, they didn't really necessarily know that they were an EOR organization because they were just kind of doing it. And over the years, this professionalized into the employer of record model. It was called a whole bunch of different stuff. There was GEO, Global Employment Organization, as a term used, but I think the industry has landed on EOR. And yeah, it's a quick solution to get boots on the ground. Commonly, it was used for entering a new market, which might start off with sales and marketing. And so you get some people, you can test the market, see how your solution fits in that particular market. The other way that it was used is for hiring talent overseas that maybe you couldn't find or you couldn't afford in your home market, which was then engineers, typically software development. And so in the COVID era, when everyone was kind of forced to work at home or people went back to their home countries, this was the time in 2020 when it kind of exploded. As various companies were trying to figure out what exactly to do with their employees, or I guess in COVID, it was two parts. It was what to do with your employees in countries after they went home. And then everyone was raising loads of money and going international and finding employees to employ all over the place. And that's when a lot of VC companies entered the EOR market and started putting a lot of money into various providers.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a second. So in terms of kind of the risk factors, so if you think about it, and again, having worked with a number of businesses that have done exactly what you've described, if I've got a client that's, say, for example, expanding into the US, my first thought process is, oh God, because, you're not dealing with a country, you're dealing with 50 different countries, right? So it makes a big difference depending on where you set up and how you set up shop, right? So what EOR, I guess, does for companies like that is allow them with low risk to be able to, bring on a team. And it typically is sales and marketing. It potentially is a bit of engineering, whatever. But, at a certain threshold, either because of cost or because of presence, it becomes not prohibitive, but it becomes more essential to have a local entity set up. So what should people be thinking about when they want to transition from EOR to a local entity? Or in your opinion, does it really make a difference, I guess?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to really think through if a company is weighing up these different solutions is, what is ultimately the strategy? What are they trying to do? What are the business activities they're going to do there? Because sometimes the business activities will dictate the type of solution you need to have.
Sure.
So, for example, we work with some various payments companies. Those companies will need to have, if they want to get a license in the country, they need to have an entity in order to apply for the license. And normally they will need to employ the people within that country themselves. So kind of rules out EOR at that point from the beginning. Now, if you have gone into a market and EOR works because you're looking to kind of test the market, generate revenue, there's always the risk of permanent establishment, which is always a bit gray. And a lawyer or a tax advisor will always be on the conservative side and say, there's risk, you should set up an entity. EOR providers will be on the side of, there's always going to be risk. You should, use EOR for a little bit and then see how it goes.
Yeah, setting your own book.
Exactly. I mean, the good thing for Go Global is we do both. So we're not kind of like pushing either one. We are impartial and just trying to give the companies a neutral view on what may happen.
Sure.
There's the cost element, which you alluded to. So maybe you get to 5 people or 10 people and you start to say, might cost less if we do this ourselves.
But, and I think this is the key point, from a pure dollar perspective, the cost may be cheaper, but from an administrative perspective, the administrative burden and overhead is actually significant, and there are costs associated with that as well.
Exactly. And complexities that if you don't quite figure out, like you really have to start thinking about tax planning, transfer pricing, once you start setting up entities, and what does it expose you to? And then you have to start getting external advice from lawyers or tax advisors. Whereas with the EOR, it's kind of, to an extent, ring-fenced that the employer of record is the legal employer, and therefore you don't have a presence. Obviously, the gray art of the EOR solution is that, it could be deemed that you do have someone on the ground if there was some kind of audit or investigation, which is why employer of record providers will always kind of put certain rules in place to remove or limit that gray area. Yeah,
it's a bit like IR35, I guess, in the UK, right? Like you've got to figure out what the parameters are. Just as you were speaking, I was just thinking about it. So, a lot of the companies that we support, for example, are at that scale-up phase, Series A, Series B. They may have just expanded into the US, or actually more typically at seed or Series A, because they're trying to attract US investors. They have to do a US topco flip because otherwise investors are just not going to put in their money. And the interesting thing there is you get all the complexity of having an entity, but you're not actually necessarily employing people, because often it is just a postbox. So are those the sort of scenarios that you would also consider managing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing because Go Global was an employer of record business first and then going into corporate services, you kind of go into that world thinking expansion is all about employing people.
Yeah.
But you realize there's all these different use cases or reasons why a company would be setting up entities, either in existing countries or new countries, and there's no intention of hiring anyone in those entities. And you see all kinds of different stuff. I mentioned a few to you earlier. Could be a topco, a holding company for European operations. Could just be to have a local billing entity, an entity to hold IP. Whole variety of reasons.
Or just tax
structuring.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
although that can go a bit crazy. I mean, I had a pre-seed founder tell me he was incorporating in Malta for tax purposes, and I was like, "But you literally
have
don't have a business.
Yeah.
What are you like? What are you solving for here? This makes no sense."
Yeah.
But I, and I think the interesting thing, and we're going to get onto this in a second, is exactly as you described, that COVID era kind of pushed a lot of this forward, right? And there were a lot of people creating solutions, and there's been some consolidation as well as you're aware. But what stuck was this global employment opportunity, because people realized that, okay, I can hire at... So a great example is, I know lots of founders who are UK based or were UK based who have now flipped to the US, have moved their sales and I guess strategic operations to the US, but actually their back office and by back office, I'm actually including engineers as well as accounting, operations, finance, etc. But what they found is you can employ an engineer for a fifth of the price in the UK as opposed to the US. So that arbitrage is still really worth doing. So that whole global expansion is no longer even about, I need boots on the ground in XYZ country. It is just, is this a more efficient way of me building my business? And I think that's what's stuck more than anything over the last few years.
Exactly. And obviously, so there is that piece around cost of employment. It's also the other side of the coin is democratizing employment.
Sure.
Right. You're now giving opportunity to people all around the world that maybe traditionally wouldn't have had access to that employer.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. It gives an equal opportunity because there's smart people in every single country. And it just gives companies the ability to access that talent as well as the talent in the country that they're already in.
Yeah. So look, we touched on this just a bit before, but Go Global chose not to pursue external funding in a period where there were a great many number of competitors, some of whom we've even had on this podcast, who went out and raced to raise venture, right? And for sure, there was a lot of money sloshing about for that. But considering the landscape we see today, what are the advantages or even disadvantages that have emerged from that decision from your perspective? And especially because I guess you joined after the fact, right?
Yes.
So you would have joined a couple of years after this frenzy was going on.
Yeah.
And how has that affected the operational choices, I guess, you're making at Go Global, as well as the longer term strategies?
Yeah. So I think you just touched on it really. The fact that we didn't raise money ultimately keeps the control and the decision making inside the business. Venture is great. The money is great for different businesses at different times. I don't think every company needs to do it. And I think it's about timing. I do think in the COVID era, there was a frenzy for everyone to raise money. And I think it somehow Go Global avoided that, which is an incredible story in itself.
Sure.
About why and how that happened. But it's ultimately given us the freedom and the autonomy to make the best decisions for the business. And for us, it is about, the first priority is service delivery, as well as our staff. Because as a service company, which ultimately employer of record is, and the other services that we do are, it's all dependent on the staff that we have, exactly, the knowledge, the expertise, and importantly, the tenure that they have inside the company. So they actually understand how things work, and the client has the same person delivering the service for them even years later. So we actually kind of, in a way, you could think that we actually put the highest value on our staff so that we can deliver the best service for our clients. And if we can focus on these two things, we're really confident because we actually understand the business and we can make the right decisions. And we have ultimately the best talent that we feel, at least in the industry, delivering those services.
Well, there's two things that come out of that, right? So firstly, you're essentially eating your own dog food, right? Because you are having to explore the landscape of employing people in order to thereafter employ people, set up entities. So you need best in class individuals, as you say. How many countries is global in currently?
So,
and how many does it service?
Yeah, so we have our own operations with our own team and our own entities in 85 countries around the world.
That's about 50%. Yeah.
Yep. And we also deliver services probably in another, 30 countries or so, realistically.
Yeah.
The exact number may change because those extra ones are kind of not as popular as the 85.
Right.
And we have our employees physically located in 60 of those countries.
Okay.
Because sometimes they might be in country A servicing country A, B, and C.
Yeah. So you may have someone in the UAE that services the whole region, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, so that, again, touching back on that kind of venture point, right? So venture typically works where your operational costs don't scale linearly with your revenue, right? But obviously, as you've alluded to several times now, because this is a service model, by its very nature, there needs to be a scaling of headcount as the business expands into different countries. You thereafter may reach some sort of equilibrium or even find economies of scale. It would be, from a venture perspective, it would be a very cash hungry business, I guess, to just get set up in those in those various regions. Yeah. And again, and this is, I find it fascinating with professional services, with all the kind of, talk around AI replacing lots of these jobs. Yeah. I would absolutely, and okay, maybe I'm just a bit of an old curmudgeon, but I would really struggle to trust an AI with setting up an entity, say in Hong Kong, to service the PRC, for example, right? Like there are just some places where you kind of want that trust. And I think, trust is probably the most important word within professional services. So how do you think about that scaling opportunity within Go Global, in the sense that I would assume you almost have to make decisions about entering a country before you even have revenue streams or significant revenue streams coming through. So it may be a strategic decision that we're going to open up in Kazakhstan, for example.
Or go global, you mean?
Or go global rather than for the client. Yeah. How do you make those decisions?
So I think if you ask any company who would be looking for a provider like Go Global, would you rather work with the company delivering the service or a company who works with a external partner? You're kind of one step removed. I think they would say that they want to work directly with the company delivering the service. It is difficult to go and
middleman.
Yeah, not exactly, but it is very difficult to go and build that model from the beginning, because as you say, how do you bring that knowledge, the experience, the understanding in-house in all countries at once? Yeah, it's not possible.
Sure.
So you kind of have to build over time. So our objective ultimately is to in-house all services that we're delivering, but it has to make economic sense as well, because we're not venture funded. So normally what we would do is build up enough demand in a country or on a particular service within a country where we would be using a partner. And then once we have knowledge, understanding, expertise, and enough revenue, then we would essentially in-house that service, which is what we did with the 85 countries.
Yeah. So essentially, it's sort of a land, understand, grow, and then internalize once you're ready. Yeah. Which is a sensible thing to do, right? So it's the bootstrap mentality, right? Like Correct. Essentially, we'll see where the demand is. We'll take small steps to be able to capture some of that demand when we think that we either have the competitive advantage or the knowledge advantage or even the scale advantage to be able to service that market more fully. Then you go in kind of
Which is good and it goes back to the point about the pros and cons of venture. Yeah. On one hand, it would be great to have loads of money to go and expand everywhere.
But that comes with headaches.
Exactly. But then that lack of funding forces you to really think and be strategic and approach it in the right way. So I actually really like this way of doing it. you feel like there isn't any kind of masking of what's happening in the business,
sure.
where you can kind of put excess cash from venture into it. Instead, you're really like living and breathing what's happening.
Yeah, I mean that that's a problem that I talk about a lot on this podcast, and certainly with founders in general, which is when you have a lot of capital on the balance sheet, it's easier to mask problems, right? So you could expand from 20 to 60 countries overnight. Great, right? You've expanded, but
and then shut 30 of them down a year later because they're not needed.
Exactly. Or, have you found the right people? Have you targeted the right countries? Like all sorts of questions that arise from those early decisions. And look, venture is great to move quickly, or certainly, in that period where dollars were just, flying everywhere, you could just raise money and try, right? I think that in any case that has changed. And I would say that, venture has become much more discerning maybe about where it parks its cash and what sort of outcomes it's considering. But in fact, just on that point, right? Because a lot of founders and VCs, certainly in the past and even today to an extent, have advocated for this model where rapid scaling through headcount was a primary kind of success metric. And you always see, right, we've gone from 30 to 60 or 60 to 150 or whatever the numbers are. But what are the practices that you think actually undermine sustainable growth, especially when you're thinking about global expansion? And how can executives kind of reconcile the need for efficiency with the expectations to scale quickly? Because I've seen it many, many times. We're expanding into this country, we're going to add 20 people, but no one's thought through the operational, the administrative, the HR, like all of those things, and the cultural aspects, right? That come with expanding so rapidly. So how do you think about that?
In a way, it kind of starts with, we've created this international expansion guide. We kind of see there's 5 key stages to international expansion. And stage 1, you could think of as business strategy or internal alignment.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it has to start, whether it's that the C-suite or the executive leadership team agree on a strategy and are aligned with that strategy. So that should be finance, that should be legal, HR, CEO, and the board.
Very happy you put finance at the top of that list.
Yeah. all aligned together on what they're doing and why they're doing it. So that, because the day-to-day running or the execution of that strategy is going to then go down to the next layer.
It cascades.
Exactly. And so if people aren't aligned, as you go through the organization layers down, it starts to get fragmented and people aren't aware that, we've got all these entities set up and did you know? No, we didn't. It gets very messy very quickly.
I've been in a business where literally the founders would set up a new entity on a whim.
Yeah.
And we'd come across, we'd be like, we got to file a confirmation statement for that one. We didn't even know it existed, for example, right?
And the good thing with EOR is that you hire someone, you make a mistake, you offboard the worker, it's okay. Yeah. When you set up an entity, it's a different story. You are established, your business has a taxable presence in a country. And it's difficult to go through liquidation process sometimes as well.
Just on that point, right? Because I've always wondered this, right? So let's say you're an EOR operating in France, for example, or Italy or Spain, right? Where labor laws are pretty full on. How does that work? Where does the liability sit? And presumably, ultimately, it always sits with the
legal employer,
the legal employer, or in which case that would sit with the EOR, right?
Correct.
Okay, fine. So how do you think about that?
That's the bad side of EOR.
Yeah.
Right. Because in the good times in 2020 to 2022, EOR was growing, loads of money going in, companies are hiring. Then 2022 and maybe 2023 as well, lots of companies are laying off and they're going out of business. And at that point, the EOR model didn't look so great because you're holding the employment responsibility. And a company that goes out of business disappears. The EOR is still there employing, 20 people, let's say. And you have to offboard these people. So there are things the EOR company does. They typically collect a deposit. Deposit would be used if the company cannot pay invoices and it gives enough time for the EOR to offboard the worker. But some of the countries you mentioned, it's not as easy as just, well, my client's gone out of business, so I'm going to offboard this employee now.
No, because
the French authority doesn't see it like that. And so, you have to follow the correct process. And ultimately, that's why companies would use someone like us. We have people on the ground who've gone through all kinds of different situations and know how to unpick these challenging and complicated compliance situations, and ultimately try to get the best outcome for the worker and our client as well.
Yeah. So I guess that goes back to kind of that question around scaling with headcount, because I guess for some companies, they may look at EOR and say, well, okay, this gives us kind of a layer of protection against, some of the more intense, shall we say, employment regulations in various countries. But irrespective of that, actually just scaling headcount too quickly leads to all sorts of second order consequences, right? That people don't think about, because again, I've worked in various countries across the globe. How you think about employing a person in the UK versus the US versus, Europe versus Southeast Asia is very different. I mean, a great example is in the US, frankly, you can let someone go with 2 weeks notice, right? Obviously in the UK, we have very, very different circumstances and situations. And as we've just said, in France, again, very different circumstances. But that also drives the way people work, right? And you may find in some jurisdictions they work to contract, and contracted hours are 9 to 5. And if you expect anything else, it's not going to happen, et cetera, right? So do you give that sort of advice to companies coming to you as well? What are the best practices in terms of when you are scaling into new countries and scaling your headcount? What are the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, absolutely. We will definitely give them the do's and don'ts, because if they do the don'ts, then it's us that ultimately are going to have the issue. So we really try to educate the client on what kind of environment they're going into, how workers typically react in these situations. We try to set the expectations as early as possible, even sometimes before they go into the country. Because normally once a hiring manager interviews someone and they love them, they got to hire that person. Doesn't matter where they are.
Yeah.
And then it kind of falls on us to employ them. And then obviously the hiring manager doesn't really care as much as their HR in the company, what they're now exposed to. We care, HR cares, and that's obviously where we will work together to navigate whatever comes up.
Well, and interestingly, presumably you have to have the same conversation with employees, right? As in, by the way, whilst you've been employed by, actually...
We're your legal employer.
We're your legal employer, and therefore, things are slightly different. Because, I remember in the US having, and this was PEOs rather than EORs, but, all sorts of things around, medical costs and insurance and the other sort of insurances that are required in the US. And then there was issues around, well, if you spend 5 days in another state or something, then you're almost, you might have to pay over tax. There. All of this sort of stuff, right? Which is both on the employee as well as the employer, and as you as a legal employer of record. So, I think what I'm trying to say here is rather you than me. It just feels like a really complex, potentially rife with pitfalls.
It is
business to be in.
The US is as easy as it is, let's say, to terminate someone. It's also very easy for the employee to make a claim and sue. Sure. Yeah. And then you typically enter this situation where you have to defend yourself. And you typically will be engaging external legal counsel, and your bills are going to rack up very quickly. And the lawyer representing the person suing you knows that. And so almost always they will just end up making a settlement outside of court. So as much as it's great because you can terminate someone easily for the context of employer of record, you also have to be super careful and kind of follow the rules.
There's always going to be legal jeopardy. Actually, out of interest, just so there's a complete kind of tangent, ignoring maybe the US, right? But where are you seeing, or where is Go Global seeing expansionary trends at the moment?
Great question. So we kind of see things in the way of inbound and outbound markets. So from an outbound perspective, meaning where are companies headquartered and expanding from. So this would be the US as the biggest, China, the UK, and also, European countries and maybe some other countries that kind of act as a bit of a springboard, but they're not necessally the headquarters. But
these are the three.
These are the three main markets,
and they're also the three major centers for venture as well. So unsurprising to an extent. Yeah,
and then obviously some European countries as well from an outbound perspective, but just not at the same scale. From an inbound perspective, you have. At least for us and what we're seeing now, Canada, the US, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, in the Americas.
Yeah. So that's where they're expanding into.
That's where a lot, people are going to Bolivia and Peru and Argentina. We see all of that stuff as well, but just in terms of the higher volume stuff. Then in the UK, it would be, in Europe, it would be UK, France, Netherlands, Germany, Spain. As very popular markets. Middle East would be UAE and Saudi Arabia. And then APAC is a lot of Japan, Singapore, and bits of South Korea, Australia as well. But Japan and Singapore, normally you'll find Singapore is like people go there first. Yeah. And then from Singapore, they go into their other places. Yeah. Singapore has kind of overtaken Hong Kong in that sense.
Yeah, which I think was primarily obviously as a result of the change in power dynamics, right? But and Singapore has so many benefits, both from a tax perspective as well as it's a bit like UAE. Yeah. In the sense you have a lot of geographically you're well placed to be able to travel into other markets. And it is recognized as a safe, secure, legally kind of secure jurisdiction to operate from. But that's really, what I find really interesting is kind of LATAM was not on my radar, I guess, right? But I guess if you're in the US or Canada, it probably does make a lot more sense. It's interesting that it's both interesting and slightly not what I was expecting, that within Europe, you're seeing expansion into UK, Germany, France, etc. It makes sense from the perspective these are the bigger markets. But when I think about maybe EOR, etc., I'm thinking, okay, where is that cost arbitrage potentially happening? And therefore I would have thought maybe the Baltics, maybe Eastern Europe, maybe Turkey, etc., would have been more likely. But it's super interesting. I think Southeast Asia completely makes sense. Singapore and Japan, 100%. I think both in terms of quality of as I mentioned, the legal situation, but also quality of talent and just access to other
opportunity.
Markets. Exactly. Although I had the founder of What 3 Words, I think his episode is going out this week. He actually set up office in Mongolia because he found really incredible staff, great English, very, very highly educated. And again, far less expensive than other areas. But other people don't do that because it's just, why would I set up shop in Mongolia, right?
Yeah, there is an interesting trend definitely emerging of nearshoring or offshoring. Because costs are rising, people are trying to find different ways. Obviously, there's AI, but it's still, as amazing as it is, it's still quite early. Yep. And so a lot of companies are making layoffs in their expensive cities like the UK or the US or somewhere like this, and basically moving that same capability to India or to Malaysia or to Poland, the Philippines, wherever it is. So that's
which was a trend like 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
And it's come back again.
Itself.
But I think the interesting thing, just in terms of looking ahead, is going to be that may be the trend now. But obviously, when you centralize these processes or capabilities into one place, obviously they're also going to be looking at how to then turn that capability into the hands of AI. So companies that might see a lot of traction now with their local population being employed should also kind of just think a few years ahead that might be somewhat temporary.
Yeah, no, I think realistically speaking, the next 3 to 5 years are unknown, right? Like I think just generally speaking, I don't think anyone can really call it. You've got the maximalists, you've got the, you've got the guys that are obviously massively doomed. I mean, like my gut feeling, and I don't think this is controversial in any way, is that you will just find lots of jobs being augmented with AI. You will find new roles appearing as a result of AI, but where that lands and what the volume looks like, I think that's still unknown. But I think to your point, it has never been more important to think about your cost structure, because ultimately, what AI has done is just collapse the cost of many things to near zero, just the cost of engineering. Tomorrow I'm interviewing the founder of Emergent, which is a business in India, a little bit like Lovable. So it's you can vibe code apps. And anyway, one of the stats that he threw at me, he said, and they've only been running for a couple of years, I think. He said, they did an analysis, and all of the apps that have been built on Emergent, if you were to go out to a development agency, to a tech agency and a dev shop to build them, would have probably cost $1 billion. So, essentially that is happening as we speak. And therefore, I think the way people think about who they employ, where they employ, why they employ becomes even more critical, because you really have to think through what are the roles that are super critical for my business, right?
And also, like if you take that, where did that $1 billion go?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because that would have been paid to all these software development companies or individuals. Now, I guess you have a lot more products and speed to market, so has that value gone somewhere else? I guess that's one of the questions to be answered.
I mean, for sure, it's like the economics of all of this is going to be incredibly interesting. You could argue that probably of however many apps it was that were built, 90% of them probably are near worthless, right? But that wouldn't have stopped people going out and paying money to buy, to build them. So maybe what it does is it brings more apps to market more quickly, and you get that kind of failure feedback loop.
I saw something the other day saying it's the age now, we're in the era of the person with the idea. Went from like people who couldn't code but had great ideas, had to kind of always have a co-founder that would build it. Now you don't necessarily need to do that. So you're right. It's like speed to market. You can get through bad ideas quickly.
I over the weekend, over about 3.5 hours, I built. So 3 years ago, I tried to build a financial modeling tool, which was absolutely beautiful, but completely worthless, and could not really, could not really do what I wanted to do, which was essentially be a modeling tool for any business. I built it in 3.5 hours. I mean, it still needs a lot of work, but in principle, it took me 3 hours. Now, again, I don't think that that's a product that is worth going out to market with or whatever, right? And it may help me or my team a little bit more. But the point is, you can now do that, right? You can build your own CRM, you can build your own X, Y, Z. And yes, I think it is now only a case of, you are limited only by your imagination, I guess, right? But not only that, but also I think you're biased for action, right? So I think actually, in this world, the people who will succeed are the people who not only have the ideas, but will then sit down and actually do something with that idea, which often has been a challenge. So look, moving away from that tangent, because that was pretty tangential. But look, the notion of best practices for global expansion often kind of emphasizes structured approaches, thorough planning, right? Because as we've discussed, right, if you're setting up an entity in XYZ region, you need to know what you have to do. But in your experience, what are the common misconceptions that leaders have about the no-go decision-making process, and what unexpected challenges arise when they're executing that plan across very diverse markets?
So I'll just reference the expansion guide again. So that first one we see is the business strategy or internal alignment. And then normally what you need to do is, once you come to that agreement, you might need to do a general country shortlist. So like, what are the potential markets you might expand to? In that case, like lots of people throw in all kinds of countries and they're like, we're going to go everywhere. We're going to go to 20 countries. Then when they start to really dig in, which would be the next stage, which is country selection of these 20. Now you need to really decide where you're going to go and why. Then they do research, like deeper research into these specific countries. And so there is a good process to follow. There's a lot of inward investment initiatives or foreign direct investment in, organizations that can help you. There's government organizations that will have various tax incentives or a network that they can introduce you to. So it's good to tap into that kind of stuff just to get a bit of an understanding of on the ground, how would it work, and start to, model out costs and timelines and process, speak to different people to understand. There's also localization of your product or of your service. Like if you're going into Germany, let's say, and you don't change your website into local language, you're probably not going to do very well, right? Because you need to understand, how do German buyers want to buy? Probably they want to buy from a German person that speaks German. And for the website to be in local language and the ongoing customer support to be in local language, all that kind of stuff.
And from a finance perspective, they use one particular set of software for everything, which all of my CFOs hate. But it's a challenge, right? Like you think that you can just overlay, for example, a back office function like finance. Yeah, it's the same product. We're doing the same thing. It should be the same thing. No, actually, you've got a whole different kind of criteria to satisfy that.
Yeah, so it's, I think at that point you get to paint a picture. You can kind of assess like, what is the size of the opportunity? How attractive is your product or service in that market? Again, like, why are you even setting up there as well? Might not be to sell or something.
Yeah.
And then you kind of go through your decision-making framework, and it should align back to the business strategy. Like, why are you doing it in the first place? And there should obviously be alignment across the different functions. Like sales department might say, we have to go. HR might say, it's impossible to let people go once we go in there. Like, are we sure? Finance may be raising issues about costs or tax or something along these lines. So you need to get that internal alignment to make sure when you go ahead, you really go, with full force and alignment.
Yeah. I mean, I think my advice to founders is always, don't expand until you absolutely have to, right? I mean, I think, and the reality is for, and this is not legal advice, but the reality is for many businesses, especially smaller businesses, you can get away with a little bit of stuff, right? At the very early stages of, thinking about expansion. So you can dip your toes without having to go full force in, right? I think obviously that's okay when it's small and when you're just testing the market. Obviously, if you are starting to do anything more, anything larger or anything more kind of complex, you need to start thinking about what does that look like legally, structurally, etc. But I think people underestimate how difficult it is to expand into new markets, because you have to essentially build a second business in a new market, right? You are going to need management there. You are, if your management, like for argument's sake, right? If you're in the UK and you set up an entity in Australia, well, time zones are going to be a bit of a problem. So you are probably going to need to have a separate management structure out there. Do you understand the difference between GST and VAT? Okay, not a massive problem, but these are the things that you got to think through. And I think, and this is very typical of founders, they just say, we'll deal with that later, right? Like, and I kind of get that, but the reality is, me coming from a kind of finance background, you can deal with it later, but the problem is by the time you get to later, you've often created such a massive mess that needs to be cleaned up that it could be consequential to the business, right?
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, it's fascinating. I think the reality is that, as a founder, global expansion or expansion in general seems really appetizing. Like I've thought about expanding into the UAE, expanding into Singapore, expanding into Spain, for example, as interesting markets for my business. But I've always stopped short because when I go through the process of, A, does it make sense? B, well, not even does it make sense. A, is there a revenue stream? B, is there, the talent to support what I need done out there? And C, actually, despite it being a similar jurisdiction to, say, the UK in terms of, we work with venture-backed businesses. Okay, there's lots of venture-backed businesses in the UAE. But actually, in terms of culture, there isn't a culture of fractional work. There is still very much a culture of office presenteeism, from what I understand. So that model doesn't necessarily lend itself particularly well to the UAE. So I think you have to really, really think very hard about what is this actually going to look like if I expand into this region? And what is it that I think is going to work the same as where I am currently, and what is going to work differently? Because it is the differences that are going to cause the problems, right? Not the similarities.
Yeah, and there's different ways of expanding. Sometimes it's not even you have to have an entity. Yeah. Maybe in your situation, as you were just explaining, maybe you would partner with someone on the ground, and in a way, you both get to test each other's markets out. You work with each other. Then a bit later, maybe you stop partnering and you expand, and you kind of skip that step. The other way as well is people expand via acquisition.
Yep.
So if you don't want to go through the process of setting everything up and hiring a local team and going slow, companies will sometimes expand via acquiring a business on the ground. They have everything set up. They have clients. They have operations. And you can enter the market that way.
Yeah, and I think that M&A sort of process is probably going to happen a lot more over the coming years, because I think, and no doubt you're seeing a bit of this, as you were saying earlier, that's now becoming one of the ICPs, is this kind of carve out M&A sort of activity. Because I think there are a lot of businesses that probably got set up 2017 to 2022, which are now possibly at the tail end of their longevity, right? As standalone businesses, they maybe aren't able to raise more money, or maybe they've set up a couple of products, one of which is not working but is still okay.
Exactly.
And therefore, that sort of footprint and foothold into a new country, the upfront cost may be higher, but actually the administrative overhead, etc., might be way lower.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, that goes back to what's the business strategy. Maybe you identify that there is an opportunity right now for your business, and that going organically and doing it slowly is just too long, and you just need to get in. Like in Saudi Arabia, there's a Saudization rule where certain percentage of your product needs to be manufactured in Saudi Arabia. That means like the components of it need to be from Saudi Arabia. So companies, in order to sell to Saudi Arabia, will just buy a factory producing their product so that they can sell product into Saudi Arabia. That's actually been something that's quite popular.
Saudi government's very smart.
Yeah.
Look, I think there's probably 100 more topics we could talk about, but to kind of round off the podcast, there's a couple of questions I asked all my guests. What is one thing that you have a contrarian conviction about from any area of life, whether that's work, politics, socially, or at home?
I was thinking about this one. I don't think I have anything that's really contrarian.
No one ever does.
To be completely honest, I was like, but I was trying to think about it. I think I'm pretty. I mean, in a way, there's enough people in the world with different opinions that it's impossible to be contrarian. I just think a lot of what I think is quite logical and rational.
Yeah.
And maybe some of the things that I have a contrarian view on probably wouldn't say in the podcast.
Okay, interesting.
We can chat afterwards.
Okay, no worries. Finally, in that case, so we can get to know the real you, what is something that moves you emotionally?
Well, I guess my parents fostered babies, like kids, when I was growing up, and just seeing the impact that you can have at an individual level on children, especially now that I have my own son as well. He's 2.5, is something that has definitely been with me in my life growing up. And so I definitely want to, as much as, working hard in business, I also want to make sure that I can give back outside of that. So that's like a nice example that my parents have given me that is quite important. And we actually ended up adopting the third baby that we fostered. We've started fostering when he was like a week old.
Wow.
He's now 16.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. I think that's absolutely lovely. Look, Jeremy, this has been a really interesting conversation, a lot of food for thought, and I have no doubt that I will get questions from others. But for the audience, if they want to find you online, where's the best place for them to look you on LinkedIn, you on Twitter or X rather? Where can they find you on the internet?
LinkedIn or goglobal.com. would be like the website for the company, and then for me personally, LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, look, we will put that all in the show notes in any case. For the time being, thank you so much for joining me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time, and thanks for having me.